The courtroom was steeped in an uneasy silence, the kind that carried the weight of expectation. Every cough, every shuffle of papers, and every creak of the wooden benches seemed magnified in the stillness. The oak-paneled walls, the polished gavel resting on the judge's bench, and the stiff posture of the jurors all combined to create an atmosphere that was equal parts intimidating and sacred. At the very center of this tension sat a little girl, no older than 8, her small frame nearly swallowed by the chair she occupied. She clutched a worn teddy bear to her chest, its fur matted from years of companionship. Her blonde hair hung limply around her pale face, and her shoes dangled inches from the floor, unable to reach. Though her body looked fragile, her presence held the attention of everyone in that courtroom. She wasn't just any child, she was the key witness in a trial that had gripped the community for months. Across the room sat the defendant, a man in his mid-30s, his suit neat, his face carefully composed, though his eyes betrayed something darker. He leaned back slightly in his chair, arms folded, watching the girl with a gaze that made even adults shiver. His attorney whispered something into his ear, but he barely nodded, his focus locked on the child. The girl noticed his stare, and for a fleeting moment, her lips trembled as if she might cry. But then she hugged the teddy tighter, whispering to it as though it could protect her. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver hair, cleared her throat and shuffled some papers. "Let us proceed," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the heavy air. The jury leaned forward, pens poised, expressions grave. Everyone in the room understood the stakes. This little girl's words could make or break the case. But the prosecutor knew the child needed help. The pressure of testifying in front of strangers, especially with the accused staring at her, was crushing. That's why, in an unusual move approved by the judge, a police officer entered the courtroom, leading a German shepherd by the leash. The dog's presence was not just for security, it was also to provide comfort to the child. The dog, a seasoned canine named Ranger, had years of service under his belt. His amber eyes scanned the room with calm authority, his paws moving silently across the floor until he sat beside the girl. The child's stiff shoulders loosened ever so slightly as she glanced down at him. Ranger gave a gentle wag of his tail, as if sensing her fear and offering his loyalty. The handler, Officer Daniels, stood beside them, tall and steady, exuding quiet reassurance. The prosecutor smiled gently at the girl. "Do you feel okay to talk?" She nodded faintly, her eyes darting nervously toward the defendant. The judge noticed and shifted in her chair, her own expression softening, just enough to remind the child she wasn't alone. But as the silence stretched on, something unexpected happened. The girl leaned closer to Ranger, pressing her lips near his ear. Her words were barely audible, but those seated near the front swore they heard her whisper. 2 words. That was all. 2 small words that would send a ripple through the courtroom so powerful, it would change the trajectory of the entire trial. The effect was immediate. Ranger's ears shot up, his muscles stiffening as though he had been given a command. A low, sharp bark broke the silence, startling everyone. The sound wasn't playful. It was alert, urgent, the kind of bark that came from instinct, not training alone. The handler gripped the leash tightly, whispering commands, but Ranger wouldn't sit. His gaze locked on the defendant, body tense, as though he had just identified a target. Gasps filled the room. The jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances, while the audience leaned forward in shock. Even the judge froze mid-sentence, her gavel hovering in the air. Dogs, especially trained police dogs, did not react without reason. The prosecutor turned sharply toward the handler. "Officer, what's going on?" Officer Daniel's face was grave. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "Ranger doesn't react like this unless—" He trailed off, uncertain how much to reveal in open court. "Unless what?" The judge pressed, her tone firm yet laced with curiosity. The handler looked at the defendant, then back at the judge. Unless he detects something. Ranger has been trained extensively to alert on threats, lies, and certain cues. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The defense attorney immediately jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is absurd. The dog's behavior is irrelevant." But before the judge could respond, the little girl raised her head. Her voice was small, but steady now, carrying across the silent room. "He knows," she said. The words seemed to echo off the walls. Every head turned toward the defendant, whose carefully controlled expression faltered for the first time. His jaw clenched, his hand twitched against the armrest, and a bead of sweat formed at his temple. Ranger growled low in his throat, his amber eyes never leaving the man. The jury sat stunned, their pens frozen above their notepads. The spectators whispered furiously, craning their necks to catch every detail. Even the judge, usually unflappable, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the defendant. The girl gripped her teddy tighter, her small body trembling, but her eyes remained fixed on Ranger, who hadn't moved an inch. For the first time since she walked into the courtroom, she felt a flicker of courage. The dog was with her. He understood. And now, so did everyone else. The judge finally broke the silence, her voice low but commanding. "Court will pause for a moment." She banged her gavel once, though her hand shook slightly as she did. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the bailiff called for order. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, whispering about the extraordinary moment they had just witnessed. The defense attorney leaned toward his client, whispering urgently, but the man didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the dog, his face pale. The little girl leaned back in her chair, her teddy bear pressed to her chest. Ranger finally sat, his tail low, but his eyes still locked on the defendant. It was as if he had given his own testimony without saying a word. What had begun as another tense day in court had suddenly shifted into something extraordinary. Two simple words, whispered by a frightened child, had carried more weight than pages of legal documents. The jury hadn't just heard them. They had felt them, underscored by the instinct of a loyal police dog. And though no one knew what would unfold in the coming days, one thing was certain: the case had just changed forever. The bark reverberated through the courtroom like a gunshot. It wasn't playful, nor accidental. It was sharp, commanding, and filled with urgency. Ranger's powerful voice shattered the silence, making even the bailiff flinch. The jurors exchanged startled glances, some instinctively leaning back as though the sound itself carried danger. The little girl gasped, her tiny fingers tightening around the teddy bear. But instead of shrinking in fear, she seemed to draw strength from the dog's reaction. Her lips parted slightly, as though she realized she hadn't imagined it. Ranger understood. Order in the court. Judge Meredith banged her gavel, but the sound was nearly drowned out by the second bark. This one was lower, more insistent. Ranger wasn't just reacting. He was signaling. Officer Daniels crouched slightly, gripping the leash tighter. "Easy, boy, easy." His voice was calm, practiced, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He knew his partner well enough to understand. This was no ordinary response. The prosecutor, Mr. Allen, rose from his seat. "Your Honor, I believe the court should hear from Officer Daniels regarding this behavior." The defense attorney leapt up before the judge could reply. "Objection. This is completely inappropriate. We are not here to analyze a dog's bark. This is a courtroom, not a kennel." Gasps rippled through the gallery at his words, many finding his dismissiveness cold, even disrespectful. The judge lifted her hand. "Enough, Mr. Pierce. Sit down." Her voice carried the authority of someone who would not tolerate nonsense. Pierce, red-faced, sat reluctantly, but his eyes darted to the jury, silently pleading with them to disregard what they had just seen. Judge Meredith turned to Officer Daniels. "Officer, control your dog, and explain immediately what just happened." Daniels swallowed hard, standing tall while Ranger remained stiff at his side. The German Shepherd's amber eyes never left the defendant. "Your Honor, Ranger is a trained canine with years of experience. He doesn't bark without cause, especially not like this. What exactly is he trained for?" the judge asked, leaning forward slightly. "Ranger's primary duties are detection and behavioral alerts," Daniels explained. "He can detect substances, threats, and he's been trained to recognize stress patterns, particularly in interrogation and courtroom settings. He signals when he perceives deception or danger." The jurors leaned in, pens scribbling furiously. A murmur ran through the audience, one woman clutching her chest, as though the revelation had just confirmed her own suspicions about the man sitting on trial. Pierce shot to his feet again. "Your Honor, I cannot allow this circus to continue. A dog is not a witness. We cannot rely on animal instincts in a court of law." But before the judge could speak, a little girl raised her trembling hand. Her voice was soft but carried in the silence that followed. "I didn't tell him anything wrong," she said. Her eyes flickered toward Ranger, then toward the defendant. "I just told him." "He knows." The room froze. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Ranger growled low, a rumble so deep it vibrated against the wooden floor. The judge's eyes snapped toward the man at the defense table. For the first time, Meredith saw him falter. His composure cracked just enough to reveal a flash of anger, maybe even fear. "Mr. Pierce," the judge said firmly, "objection overruled. The jury will consider the significance of what they have seen and heard." The defense attorney sank into his chair, frustration etched across his face. Ranger barked once more, this time shorter, sharper, like a gavel of his own. His body remained tense, tail low, eyes locked on the accused. Daniels stroked his fur, murmuring, "Good boy, steady." The prosecutor seized the opportunity. He stepped closer to the witness stand, lowering his voice so it sounded gentler for the child. "Sweetheart," he said, "can you tell us again what you whispered to Ranger?" The girl's knuckles whitened as she clutched her teddy. Her eyes darted to the jury, then to the judge, but finally settled on Ranger. "I said, he knows." Alan nodded encouragingly. "And who were you talking about when you said that?" Her gaze shifted toward the defendant. Her lips trembled, but she forced the words out. "Him." The gallery erupted into murmurs so loud the bailiff had to shout for silence. The defendant's face turned pale, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if anchoring himself. Ranger stood, pulling slightly against the leash, his entire body aimed like a weapon at the man. Daniel's muscles tensed as he held him back, but the dog's instincts were unrelenting. Judge Meredith banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" It took nearly a full minute for the noise to settle. The jury, however, was silent, their eyes fixed on the girl as though she had just shifted the entire weight of the case with those two words. The prosecutor straightened. "Your Honor, the child's statement, coupled with the canine's trained reaction, should not be dismissed. This is not coincidence. This is corroboration." Pierce jumped up again. "This is manipulation. Dogs cannot testify. Children can be coached. This entire display is a distraction from the lack of real evidence." The judge's eyes hardened. "Sit down, Mr. Pierce, before I hold you in contempt." The defense attorney sat, seething, but his client leaned toward him, whispering furiously. The whispering didn't go unnoticed. Ranger snarled, pulling forward once again, the tension on the leash palpable. Daniels barely restrained him. The judge noticed. "Officer Daniels," Is your canine responding to the defendant's behavior? Yes, Your Honor, Daniels replied firmly. Ranger has been trained to detect stress signals, microexpressions, and vocal tones. His reaction is no accident. He's reading something in the defendant. The juror's eyes widened, some glancing toward the defendant with unease. The man shifted again, tugging at his collar, his composure slipping further. The little girl spoke again, this time louder, braver. He knows what he did. Her voice broke on the last word, but the clarity of her statement was undeniable. The prosecutor turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this child's courage and the corroborating behavior of Ranger cannot be ignored. This is not a coincidence, it is a breakthrough. Judge Meredith sat back in her chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin. The courtroom waited, every soul holding its breath. Finally, she said, we will allow the child to continue her testimony. With the K-9 present, the gallery buzzed again, the atmosphere charged like a storm. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions shifting, the scales of justice tilting before their eyes. The defendant glared at the little girl, but she didn't look away this time. Ranger growled once more, sharp and protective, placing himself between the child and the man's gaze. In that moment, everyone understood something extraordinary had happened. A frightened child had whispered 2 words, and a dog's unshakable instincts had turned the courtroom upside down. And though the trial was far from over, the balance had shifted. The truth had found its voice through the courage of a little girl and the loyalty of a dog who could not be fooled. The gavel struck the wood with a sharp crack, demanding silence. Yet even as the echoes faded, the tension in the courtroom remained suffocating. Everyone's eyes darted between the little girl clutching her teddy bear, the restless canine whose low growl rumbled like thunder, and the defendant shifting uneasily at the defense table. Judge Meredith's sharp gaze fell on Officer Daniels. Officer, you will explain this immediately. Why is your K-9 behaving this way? Daniels straightened, his grip steady on Ranger's leash, though the German shepherd's muscles quivered with restrained energy. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady but heavy. Ranger is not an ordinary dog. He is a highly trained canine with specialized capabilities. His reaction here is deliberate. The courtroom leaned in. Jurors poised their pens, journalists' fingers hovered above keyboards, and spectators barely breathed. The judge tilted her head. Explain for the record. Yes, Your Honor. Daniels cleared his throat. Ranger has been trained for detection of explosives, narcotics, and concealed items. But beyond that, he has extensive training in behavioral alerts. He's conditioned to pick up on micro-expressions, changes in tone, stress pattern signals that often indicate deception, aggression, or hidden intent. When he reacts, it's because he has perceived something significant. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Someone whispered, "So he can tell when someone's lying?" The defense attorney, Mr. Pierce, shot up. Objection. This is outrageous. We cannot allow this court to devolve into pseudoscience. A dog cannot testify, and its so-called instincts are not admissible evidence. Judge Meredith's gavel cracked again. Sit down, Mr. Pierce. You will have your chance. Reluctantly, Pierce lowered himself, his jaw clenched tight. The judge turned to the little girl. Her face was pale, her eyes watery, but she sat a little taller with Ranger by her side. "Child," the judge said gently, softening her tone, "did you say something to Ranger before he reacted?" The girl hesitated, then nodded. The courtroom hushed, the silence heavy with anticipation. "What did you say?" Her voice was fragile, but it carried clearly across the chamber. "I said, he knows." A collective gasp swept through the room. The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing louder than the child's small voice could carry. The judge's eyes narrowed. "And when you said he knows, who were you referring to?" The little girl turned her head slowly, her trembling hand lifting to point at the defendant. Him. Every gaze swung to the man at the defense table. His face, carefully composed until now, betrayed the faintest crack. His lips pressed into a thin line, his nostrils flared, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He shifted in his chair, tugging at his collar, as though the room had grown unbearably hot. Ranger growled again, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the wooden floor. Daniel steadied him, but didn't try to silence the dog completely. Everyone could see where Ranger's attention was fixed on the man accused of crimes too terrible to name aloud in front of the child. The jurors exchanged glances. Some scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Others stared openly, their expressions grim. The prosecution's eyes gleamed with sudden opportunity, while the defense attorney muttered angrily under his breath. "Your Honor." Pierce's voice cracked as he surged to his feet again. This is nonsense. The ramblings of a frightened child and the reflexes of an animal cannot be allowed to sway this court. This is prejudice, pure and simple. But before the judge could respond, the little girl's voice rose again. Louder this time, steadier, braver. "He knows what he did." The gallery erupted in gasps, whispers, and even a few cries. The bailiff shouted for order, but it was chaos for nearly a full minute. The defendant slammed a hand on the table, startling his own attorney. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his composure unraveling. His voice was harsher than before, his eyes flashing with barely contained rage. Ranger responded instantly. He lunged forward, stopped only by Daniel's firm grip on the leash, barking ferociously at the outburst. The courtroom shook with the sound. The little girl flinched, but didn't cry this time. She seemed to draw strength from the dog's unwavering defense. Judge Meredith's voice cut through the chaos, steel in every syllable. "Enough! Order in this courtroom." She struck her gavel repeatedly until the noise subsided. Silence fell again, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was charged, electric, humming with the sense that something monumental had shifted. The judge looked to the jury. "You have seen with your own eyes and heard with your own ears. The witness has made a statement, and the canine has reacted in a manner consistent with his training. You are to weigh this as you would any testimony." Pierce protested again, his face red. "You're letting superstition poison these proceedings." The judge's icy glare silenced him faster than her gavel. The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice calm but deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you witnessed what happened. No coaching, no manipulation, just a child's instinct and a dog's training converging in this room. Two simple words, whispered in innocence, revealed more truth than 1,000 pages of testimony." The jurors didn't move, their faces grave. But their eyes said enough. Something in the balance of the trial had shifted. The little girl sat back in her chair, clutching her teddy, her breathing shaky, but her chin lifted higher than before. Ranger sat beside her now, calmer, but his amber eyes still locked on the defendant, like a sentinel guarding against evil. The defendant avoided the jury's gaze, staring instead at his folded hands. But the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. He knew the eyes of the entire courtroom were on him. Worse, he knew they were beginning to believe the child. For the first time since the trial began, the veneer of control slipped away. And with it, so did the defense's carefully constructed illusion of innocence. By the time Judge Meredith called for a recess, the courtroom was buzzing with hushed whispers and hurried speculation. Reporters nearly tripped over each other as they rushed to phone in the update. Jurors exchanged looks they weren't supposed to, silently acknowledging the gravity of what had just occurred. And at the heart of it all sat a fragile child, a loyal dog, and two words that had cracked open the truth for everyone to see. "He knows." They were just words, but in that courtroom, they carried the weight of 1,000 truths. The silence that followed the girl's brave declaration was thick, almost unbearable. Then, like the snap of a rope under strain, the defense attorney leapt to his feet, his chair screeching against the polished floor. "This is outrageous," Pierce's voice boomed, bouncing off the paneled walls. His face flushed red, and sweat glistened at his hairline. "This court cannot permit a child's frightened words and an animal's bark to dictate justice. We are in a court of law, Your Honor, not a circus." His tone bordered on desperation, but he tried to mask it with indignation. The jurors watched carefully, their pens scratching faintly, their eyes shifting between Pierce, his client, and the trembling girl on the witness stand. Judge Meredith raised an eyebrow, her gavel still resting firmly in her hand. "Mr. Pierce, you will control yourself. The court has heard enough from you for the moment." Pierce bristled. But before he could argue further, the prosecutor rose, his movements calm, deliberate. Mr. Allen adjusted his tie, glanced reassuringly at the girl, then addressed the judge. "Your Honor," Allen began, his voice smooth yet firm, "the defense would have you believe that what occurred was nothing but a coincidence. But let us not underestimate what everyone in this courtroom just witnessed with their own eyes." The child whispered, the canine reacted, and the defendant's composure fractured in plain sight. "I respectfully request that Ranger remain present while the witness continues her testimony. His presence clearly gives her courage. Removing him now would serve only to weaken her ability to speak the truth." The defense attorney exploded. "Absolutely not. This is manipulation. Allowing that animal to stay is nothing less than stacking the deck against my client." The judge fixed Pierce with a glare so sharp it seemed to slice the air between them. "Mr. Pierce, sit down before you try my patience further." The gallery buzzed with quiet whispers, people leaning toward each other, excitement and tension swirling like smoke. The jurors exchanged discreet glances. Even if Ranger wasn't officially evidence, his behavior had already left a mark in their minds. Judge Meredith folded her hands. "Mr. Allen, you make a strong case. Officer Daniels, the dog may remain in the courtroom, but under strict control. The court will not allow unnecessary disruption." "Yes, Your Honor," Daniels replied, giving Ranger's leash a light tug. The German shepherd sat obediently, though his eyes never strayed from the defendant. The little girl exhaled, her shoulders lowering slightly, relief washing over her face. She stroked the top of Ranger's head with trembling fingers, and for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, the corners of her mouth hinted at the smallest fleeting smile. The defendant, however, shifted uncomfortably. His fingers tapped restlessly on the table, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched. His composure, once impenetrable, now resembled glass facade that might shatter with the slightest pressure. The prosecutor approached the witness stand again, his voice gentle. "You're doing very well," he told the girl. "Do you feel okay to continue?" She nodded, hugging her teddy bear with one arm and keeping the other hand resting on Ranger's thick fur. Across the room, the defense attorney muttered something harshly into his client's ear, but the man didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the dog, his expression a mix of resentment and unease. Ranger tilted his head slightly, as if studying every flicker of movement, every twitch of guilt the man couldn't quite hide. The jurors were watching too. They saw the girl's small hand gripping her comfort toy, her courage anchored by the silent strength of the dog beside her. They also saw the defendant's stiffness, his discomfort growing more visible with every second Ranger's gaze stayed fixed on him. The contrast was stark, innocence and vulnerability gaining strength through loyalty, set against a man unraveling under the weight of unspoken truths. Judge Meredith finally broke the silence. "The witness may continue." Allen nodded and turned back to the girl. "Can you tell us, in your own words, What happened that night? The girl's lips trembled, but when she glanced at Ranger, her courage grew. She adjusted her teddy bear, drew in a shaky breath, and began. It was dark, and I was scared. Her voice carried through the courtroom, fragile yet steady, each word painting the picture of a night that had haunted her ever since. The jurors leaned in, pens frozen in midair, as if afraid to miss even a syllable. And though her story had only just begun, it was clear to everyone that the truth was finally pushing its way to the surface, fueled by the courage of a child, the determination of a prosecutor, and the unwavering instincts of a dog who could not be fooled. Meanwhile, the defendant's discomfort deepened. He shifted in his seat again, tugging at his collar. The sweat at his temple glistened under the fluorescent lights. His fingers drummed the table louder now, betraying the storm brewing within him. One juror noticed and jotted something down quickly. Another stole a glance at Ranger, whose body stiffened every time the defendant moved. The battle lines in the courtroom were invisible but undeniable. On one side stood truth, fragile but resolute, bolstered by loyalty and courage. On the other sat denial, its defenses crumbling piece by piece. The defense had tried to scramble, to dismiss, to object. But no objection could erase what everyone had already seen. And though the trial was far from over, the shift was clear. The jury wasn't just listening anymore. They were watching. Watching the child, the dog, and the man who seemed less untouchable with every passing moment. The truth wasn't just in words now. It was in every gesture, every reaction, every unguarded crack in the mask of a man who knew. And the courtroom, once heavy with silence, now vibrated with the unspoken certainty that the tide was turning. The girl sat quietly, gripping her teddy bear in one arm, the other hand still resting on Ranger's thick, steady fur. The German shepherd sat rigidly beside her, his ears perked, his eyes unwavering in their fixation on the man seated at the defense table. Judge Meredith's voice was calm, yet firm. "You may continue, sweetheart. Take your time." The girl gave a small nod. She took a shaky breath, her tiny shoulders rising and falling like waves, struggling against the storm. Then she began. "It was late," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I was already in bed, but I couldn't sleep. I heard a noise, like someone was trying to open the back door. I remember pulling the blanket up to my face because I was scared." Her words hung in the air. Every juror leaned forward slightly, their pens hovering, as if afraid that writing might cause them to miss something vital. "I thought maybe it was my mom coming home," the girl continued, her voice gaining the faintest strength. But then I heard his voice. She turned her gaze, slowly, toward the defendant. Her small finger trembled as it pointed at him. It was him. The defendant shifted instantly, his chair creaking loudly. Ranger's ears shot up, his body stiffening. A low growl rumbled from his chest, vibrating across the silent courtroom. The handler kept his grip firm on the leash, but made no move to hush the animal. Ranger's instincts were speaking louder than any lawyer could. The prosecutor, Mr. Allen, nodded encouragingly. "You're doing very well." What happened next? The girl's lips trembled, but she pressed on. He came inside. I remembered his shoes on the floor. Heavy. Slow. He walked through the house, like he already knew where everything was. A gasp rippled through the gallery. The defense attorney bolted up. "Objection, Your Honor. This child is scared, confused, and clearly being led by the presence of that animal. She can't possibly." The judge's gavel cracked against the wood. "Sit down, Mr. Pierce. The objection is overruled. The witness will continue." Pierce's face reddened, but he bit his tongue. The girl's eyes glistened as she gripped her teddy tighter. "I was hiding behind the curtain, right by the window. I thought if I stayed quiet, he wouldn't find me. But he did. The jurors' faces hardened, jaws clenched, eyes narrowing on the defendant. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself forward. He told me not to say anything. He said nobody would believe me because I was just a kid. And he smiled. Ranger growled again, louder this time. The sound rippled through the room like a warning bell. The defendant's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward the dog in open frustration. His leg bounced uncontrollably under the table. But then the girl said something that made the prosecutor freeze in place. He left something behind that night. The room went utterly still. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to pause. Alan stepped closer. "What do you mean, sweetheart? What did he leave behind?" She took a breath, her small chest heaving. "He dropped something. I didn't tell anyone before. I didn't think it mattered. But I remember. It was a key. A silver key. It had a little blue sticker on it." Gasps broke out across the courtroom. Alan's eyes widened. He quickly turned to the officers seated behind him. Was this in the evidence file? He demanded in a hushed but urgent tone. The lead investigator shook his head slowly, his brow furrowing. The defense attorney jumped to his feet again. "Your Honor, this is absurd. She's fabricating stories now." But Judge Meredith cut him off sharply. "Mr. Pierce, if you interrupt this child again, I will hold you in contempt. Sit down." He sank into his chair, fuming, his papers rattling under his fists. Alan crouched slightly, lowering his voice to the girl's level. "Can you tell us where you saw the key?" Her voice grew steadier. "By the fireplace. He dropped it when he was leaving. I heard it fall on the bricks. I saw the blue sticker when he bent to pick it up. He didn't know I was watching." Alan straightened, his mind racing. A hidden location, only the guilty would know. A detail no one else could possibly invent. The jury was transfixed. They scribbled furiously now, their eyes darting between the girl, the dog, and the defendant whose face had drained of color. The defendant's hand clenched into a fist on the table. He muttered something under his breath, too quiet to catch, but the tension in his body screamed louder than words. Ranger rose halfway to his paws, growling in warning. The handler whispered a command, but the dog refused to break eye contact with the man. Alan turned back to the girl. "And did you tell anyone about this key before today?" She shook her head. "No, I thought. No one would believe me. But Ranger, he believed me." The words struck the courtroom like lightning. The jurors' expressions soft toward the girl, their sympathy radiating. But the defense attorney scrambled desperately, standing again. "This is nothing but a child's imagination. A fairy tale with no proof." "We cannot." Alan cut him off, voice booming. "Proof? Then let's test her claim. Officer Daniels, after this recess, I want your team to search that fireplace." Judge Meredith nodded firmly. "So ordered." The recess will allow for an immediate search. The gallery erupted into whispers, excitement buzzing like electricity through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, their headlines practically writing themselves. The defendant's mask of composure finally shattered. He slammed his palm on the table, muttering curses under his breath, his attorney grabbing his arm to calm him. The jury watched everything, the outburst, the sweat, the cracks forming in what once seemed like an unshakable facade. Ranger barked sharply, the sound echoing like a gavel of its own. The girl flinched, but did not cry. She sat taller, gripping her teddy, her small hand never leaving Ranger's fur. For the first time, her fear seemed outweighed by determination. The courtroom had just shifted on its axis. This wasn't simply testimony anymore. It was revelation one that could dismantle the defense's entire case. And as the officers prepared to leave for the search, every soul in the room knew one thing. If that silver key with the blue sticker existed, the trial was over. The truth had slipped through the cracks of fear, carried by the voice of a child, and confirmed by the instincts of a dog who never wavered. The case had taken a turn so dramatic, so undeniable, that the path to justice now seemed inevitable. And the man at the defense table knew it. His eyes darted wildly. His calm was gone. For the first time, the jury saw not just a defendant. They saw guilt, trembling in plain sight. The courtroom buzzed with a low hum of whispers as officers filed out to search the location the girl had described. The recess had ended, and everyone returned to their seats, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. Something had shifted, something irreversible. The defendant sat stiffly at the table, his hands folded too tightly, knuckles pale against the polished wood. His eyes darted from the jury to the girl to Ranger, but never stayed still for long. He was a man unraveling, each thread of composure slipping faster than he could stitch it back together. The jury noticed. They always noticed. Judge Meredith gave a sharp rap of her gavel. This court is back in session. The prosecution may continue. Mr. Allen rose, his movements calm, deliberate. He didn't rush. He wanted the silence to stretch, to let the jurors feel the weight of the moment. Then he approached the stand again, his eyes softening as they met the little girl's. "You're doing very well," he said gently. "Would you like to continue telling us what happened?" The girl clutched her teddy bear and nodded. Her voice, though quiet, carried more strength than before. "After he told me not to say anything, he left. But I remember the sound of his car. It was loud, like it needed fixing. I never forgot it. Several jurors scribbled notes instantly. The detail was oddly specific, too specific to invent." The defense attorney, Pierce, shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I object to this continued leading of the witness. She is a frightened child, easily." The judge raised a hand, silencing him with a look. "Objection overruled. She is recounting events in her own words." "Sit down, Mr. Pierce." Ranger growled low again, his eyes locked firmly on the defendant. The growl seemed to crawl up the defendant's spine. His fingers drummed nervously against the table, faster and louder, until Pierce leaned in to whisper harshly in his ear. The man nodded stiffly, but the tapping resumed seconds later, betraying the storm within. The girl, emboldened by Ranger's presence, continued. "He thought I didn't see, but I did. He had something in his hand when he left. A bag. And there was something sticking out of it. I think it was a glove." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through every corner of the courtroom. Pierce jumped again. "Speculation. This child is imagining things." But the prosecutor cut in smoothly. "Or perhaps she's recalling a detail only someone present would know." He turned back to the girl. "You're doing great. Can you tell us how you felt in that moment?" Her small hands trembled, but her voice steadied. "Scared, but also angry. Because I knew he thought no one would ever believe me. But I remembered everything." Ranger let out a sharp bark, startling some in the gallery. His handler gave a quick command, but the dog's focus never wavered. It was as if the animal himself understood the weight of the child's testimony. The defendant shifted again, this time loosening his tie, his breath quickening. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, catching the light as it fell. He wiped it quickly with the back of his hand, but the jurors saw. One juror leaned toward another, whispering something before both nodded grimly. Allen paced slowly before the jury box, his voice calm but cutting. "Ladies and gentlemen, note what you see. Note the child's courage, the dog's instinct, and the defendant's discomfort." "Objection." Pierce barked. "The prosecution is testifying." "Overruled," Judge Meredith said sharply. "The jury will consider only the evidence, but they may also weigh the credibility of each witness." Allen smiled faintly. The point had been made. The girl looked at Ranger again, and for the first time since she sat down, she straightened her back. The trembling had lessened. Her words came clearer, stronger, each syllable sharper than the last. "I used to have nightmares," she admitted softly. "Every night. But then I met Ranger. He didn't need me to explain anything. He just knew. He made me feel like maybe I wasn't crazy. Like maybe someone finally believed me." The gallery stirred with emotion. Mothers dabbed their eyes with tissues. Fathers clenched their jaws. Reporters scribbled madly. The defendant clenched his fist so hard that the veins on his hands stood out, purple against pale skin. His chest rose and fell quickly, betraying the effort it took to keep from erupting. And the jury saw it all. Alan's tone sharpened, directing his next question like a blade. "When you say he smiled that night, can you describe it?" The girl's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "It wasn't nice. It was cold, like he thought it was funny that I was scared." The defendant slammed his palm against the table, making the wood shake. The sudden crack echoed like a gunshot. "Order!" Judge Meredith thundered, striking her gavel. "Mr. Pierce, control your client, or I will." Pierce tugged at his client's arm, whispering furiously, but the man's composure was shredded. His chest heaved, his eyes burned, and the jury's pens flew across their notepads, documenting every outburst. Ranger barked again, loud and sharp, his body surging forward against the leash. The handler barely restrained him, his voice firm but urgent with commands. The dog's instincts screamed louder than words. This man was not innocent. The jurors didn't need to be told. They were watching guilt unravel in real time. Alan didn't press further for now. He let the silence sit heavy, let the image burn into the jury's minds. The child, calm and honest. The dog, steady and alert. The defendant, cracking apart before their eyes. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low, deliberate. "No further questions, Your Honor. For now." The judge nodded. "We'll recess for lunch. Court will resume at 2:00. Her gavel struck, but the echo didn't erase the image burned into every mind in the room. The jurors left whispering, their eyes still fixed on the defendant's stiff posture. The gallery buzzed with reporters rushing for the exit, their phones already in hand, headlines forming, child testimony and police dog shake courtroom. A girl hugged her teddy and leaned into Ranger, who licked her hand softly. For the first time, her lips curved into a faint smile. The defendant remained frozen, fists clenched, his body trembling as if every eye in the room were knives pressed against his skin. And in many ways, they were. The mask he had worn so carefully for months had cracked, and everyone had seen it. The jury had seen it. The judge had seen it. The gallery had seen it. And Ranger? Ranger had known all along. The truth was no longer a distant possibility. It was clawing its way into the open, piece by piece, fueled by a child's bravery and a dog's unshakable instinct. And the defendant, once so composed, was unraveling with every breath. The gavel fell for the final time before the recess, but the sound did little to calm the storm already raging in the courtroom. The room remained thick with tension, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the girl's testimony and Ranger's unrelenting presence. Jurors rose slowly, some whispering to one another in hushed tones. They didn't leave quickly. None could shake the images and words they had just witnessed. The little girl's bravery, the dog's sharp growls, the defendant's faltering composure, it all lingered, pressing down like a physical force. The gallery erupted in a controlled chaos. Reporters grabbed their phones, cameras, and notepads, scrambling to file updates and call editors. Fingers flew across keyboards, dictating stories that already had headlines. Child witness and police dog shake courtroom, and defendant's composure cracks after 2 words. Some audience members whispered furiously to each other. One mother muttered under her breath, clutching her child's hand, "I can't believe it." A child that brave. The defendant remained at the defense table, fists clenched, jaw tight, shoulders trembling just enough for anyone watching to notice. Pierce tugged at his client's arm, trying to whisper some advice, but the man barely responded. His eyes were locked on Ranger, who now sat with the patience of a predator, silently watching, waiting. Even as the courtroom emptied slightly, the dog's presence alone seemed to anchor the girl's courage. She stroked Ranger's fur, her eyes meeting his steady amber gaze. In that small glance, there was understanding. She wasn't alone. The jurors, retreating slowly toward the exit, exchanged glances with subtle nods. One scribbled a note in the margins of her notebook. Child's details match known evidence. Defendant visibly stressed. Another whispered softly, "Did you see the way he reacted when she mentioned the key?" The murmurs built into a low hum, a storm of silent observations and private judgments. And every whisper fed the tension like wind fanning flames. Allen, the prosecutor, remained near the witness stand, clipboard in hand. He didn't rush. He knew the recess was his ally. The jury needed time to process what had happened, and the defendant needed time, but he would not regain control in that short interval. The defendant's eyes darted nervously from the jurors to the exit doors and back to Ranger. Every step someone took, every cough or shuffle, seemed to raise his anxiety. The dog's eyes remained locked on him, unwavering. Every muscle in Ranger's body suggested a readiness to act, silent yet unnerving. Pierce, desperate to regain some semblance of authority, whispered again. The defendant shook his head slightly, muttering under his breath. Sweat glistened on his brow as he tugged at his tie, trying to regain the mask he had so carefully constructed. But the mask was cracking, and everyone could see the effort it took to hold it together. Meanwhile, the little girl leaned back slightly, taking a small, shaky breath. She felt the weight of eyes on her, some compassionate, some curious, and a few filled with doubt. But Ranger's presence reminded her she was not alone. His steady gaze lent her courage she hadn't known she possessed just hours ago. In the hallway, reporters clamored to transmit stories, voices overlapping in a cacophony of excitement. One camera operator muttered, "If this key story holds up, it's game over for him." Another reporter nodded, typing rapidly. Child witness reveals hidden clue. Police dog reacts to defendant stress. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained electric. Even in recess, the energy lingered, impossible to dissipate. Every footstep on the polished floors, every whisper, every shuffle of papers reminded everyone that this was far from ordinary proceedings. The jury returned slowly after a few minutes, still whispering quietly to one another. Their expressions were grave, reflecting the weight of the testimony they had just absorbed. Some avoided the defendant's gaze entirely, while others glanced once or twice, noting the visible cracks in his composure. The defendant tried to straighten, attempting a veneer of calm, but his leg bounced, subtle yet undeniable. He wiped his palms against his pants repeatedly, muttered something under his breath, and even tried to force a smile at his attorney, but it was hollow, and no one missed it. Ranger, sensing the slightest shift, tensed. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Daniels whispered softly, but the dog didn't break eye contact with the man. It was silent testimony in itself. The instincts of the dog confirmed what everyone had suspected. The judge returned to her bench, her presence cutting through the room like sunlight through clouds. The court is back in session. Please be seated. All eyes turned forward. The air felt heavier now, laden with anticipation. No one could deny the tension that had built to a nearly unbearable level. Allen stepped forward, clipboard in hand, calm and deliberate. He didn't rush. He allowed the silence to stretch, let the jury feel the weight of the previous testimony. Then he spoke, his voice low but clear. Ladies and gentlemen, the child witness has provided information that has never before been presented in this courtroom. Her statements, corroborated in part by the trained behavior of a K-9 officer, have illuminated details that change our understanding of the events in question. The gallery shifted, some leaning forward, others gripping the edges of their seats. Every eye seemed glued to the defendant, whose breathing was shallow, hands fidgeting as he tried to regain control. Pierce opened his mouth, perhaps to object again, but the judge held up a hand. No further interruptions will be tolerated. This is the last recess before testimony resumes in full. Proceed with caution, Mr. Allen. Allen nodded, stepping closer to the jury. Observe the reactions before you, he said quietly. Observe the behavior, the stress, the subtle tells. Remember them, for they may speak louder than words in the coming minutes. The defendant's eyes flicked toward the jury, panic visible in the small movements of his lips. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently, but Ranger's low growl interrupted any semblance of calm he might have hoped for. The child sat upright, small but resolute. Her hands rested lightly on Ranger's fur, her courage fed by his presence. She had faced the storm, and now the storm was facing her. Every movement mattered now. Every glance, every gesture, every blink and twitch of the defendant's body was under scrutiny. The court was holding its collective breath, waiting for the next revelation, the next unraveling of truth. And it was coming. The tension was palpable, like a cord stretched too tightly. The jury could feel it, the gallery could sense it, and even the defendant could feel the invisible weight pressing down on him. Ranger's eyes never left the man. The growl had subsided slightly, but the readiness remained, a silent sentinel of instinct and loyalty. The little girl adjusted her teddy bear, exhaled slowly, and prepared to continue. This was the moment when the truth, once fragile and hidden, would push further into the light. And everyone in the courtroom knew it. The storm of revelation was not over. It had only just begun. The courtroom held its breath as the recess ended, the air thick with anticipation. The little girl sat upright, clutching her teddy bear, Ranger by her side, and her eyes steady on the judge. The officers returned quietly, one carrying a small evidence bag. Inside was the object that had been hidden all along the silver key, its little blue sticker gleaming under the overhead lights. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Reporters scrambled, capturing the moment on cameras and phones alike. Every juror leaned forward, eyes wide, pens poised over their notebooks. The key was real. Her memory, her observation, had been correct. The defendant's face drained of color. He froze, unable to speak, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. Sweat streaked down his forehead, his carefully constructed composure unraveling faster than he could conceal it. Judge Meredith's gaze swept over the courtroom. Officers, please enter the key into evidence. The lead investigator nodded, placing the small bag on the evidence table. Every eye in the courtroom remained fixed on it, aware that this single object now carried immense weight. Allen, the prosecutor, stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the witness observed and remembered an item that had never been documented. Her recollection led to its discovery. This corroborates her testimony and casts doubt on the defendant's version of events. The girl's small hand tightened on Ranger's fur as the room reacted. She had done more than recount fear. She had revealed truth. And now it was undeniable. Pierce rose, his face pale but defiant. Your Honor, this is still circumstantial. The key's presence does not prove any crime. It is irrelevant and... Sit down. Judge Meredith thundered, her gavel striking with authority. "You have had your opportunity. Your objections are noted, but the court will proceed." Ranger's low growl vibrated through the room as if punctuating her statement. The defendant's eyes flicked to the dog, panic rising in their amber depths. Every twitch of his body betrayed the inner turmoil he could no longer hide. The little girl, sensing the moment had arrived, took a shaky breath. "He said nobody would believe me," she whispered. But Ranger knew. "I knew, and now everyone can see." A hush fell over the courtroom, heavier than silence itself. The defendant's face had turned a ghostly pale. His lips pressed into a tight line. His fingers twitched uncontrollably. Every juror leaned in, absorbing the tension like an electric charge. Alan began summarizing, his voice deliberate. "You have seen a child witness recount details no one else knew, leading to the discovery of a key item. You have observed the reactions of the defendant, his composure failing under scrutiny. And you have witnessed the instinctive behavior of a trained K9, responding to cues invisible to most of us." The jury scribbled furiously. Their faces were solemn, some jaws tight with focus, others' eyes shimmering with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. The defendant attempted to speak, his voice shaky and brittle. This is nonsense. There's no proof, none." "You can't," Ranger barked sharply, loud enough to silence him instantly. Daniels held the leash firmly, but the dog's gaze never wavered. The jurors watched the tension writhe across the man's body. The dog's instinct spoke louder than any testimony. Alan spoke again, his tone unwavering. "The evidence is before you. The child has recounted details that have led directly to physical evidence. The defendant's reaction demonstrates guilt, and the K9's response further supports the credibility of her testimony. The truth is clear." The defendant's breaths were shallow, rapid. He tried to straighten, to regain some dignity, but his hands shook violently. Pierce whispered frantically, but the man couldn't respond. Ranger's eyes never left him. The dog had seen through every pretense. The gallery shifted, some holding their breath, others murmuring softly. The tension was nearly unbearable. Every person in that room sensed the moment teetering on the edge of revelation. Judge Meredith finally addressed the jury. "Members of the jury, you have observed all testimony, all evidence, and all reactions in this courtroom. The case now rests before you. You will deliberate on the truth as you have witnessed it." The jurors stood slowly, their notebooks clutched tight. They filed out of the courtroom, their expressions solemn but determined. Some exchanged subtle nods, silent acknowledgments that the case had shifted dramatically in the child's favor. The defendant remained at his table, pale and rigid, staring at Ranger as if the dog were some relentless judge. Sweat rolled down his temples. His breaths came in shallow bursts. Every inch of his body screamed the inner realization. The tide had turned, and there was no escape. Alan stood quietly by the evidence table, giving the girl a reassuring smile. She hugged Ranger's fur, drawing courage from his silent loyalty. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had spoken the truth, and it had been acknowledged. Minutes stretched into eternity as the jury deliberated. Each member carried in their mind the child's words, the dog's responses, and the defendant's unraveling. The room waited with bated breath. Finally, the jury returned. Their faces were grave but resolute. They handed the verdict slip to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Meredith. The courtroom fell silent again. Even the defendant's trembling seemed to echo off the walls. Judge Meredith opened the slip, scanning the words, and then raised her gaze. "Members of the jury," she said, her voice steady and commanding, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, her hand shaking slightly as she held the slip. "We have, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Please read it aloud." The words, when spoken, cut through the air like a blade. "We, The jury find the defendant guilty on all counts. A gasp swept through the gallery. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. The defendant's face crumpled, his mask of control shattered completely. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The little girl exhaled softly, gripping Ranger's fur. He nuzzled her hand, a silent companion in triumph. The courtroom erupted in a mix of stunned murmurs, restrained applause, and the quiet awe of witnessing justice realized. Judge Meredith's gavel fell, ringing order. The court thanks the jury for their service. Sentencing will be scheduled accordingly. The defendant's attorney leaned over, whispering frantically, but the man's head remained buried. He had lost control, lost the pretense of innocence, and the truth had been laid bare for all to see. Ranger's presence was more than symbolic. The dog had affirmed the courage of a child and the unraveling of deceit. The courtroom's eyes, now wide with relief and satisfaction, reflected the power of instinct and honesty in tandem. The little girl, small and brave, finally allowed herself a tentative smile. Her voice had been heard. Her truth had prevailed. And the courtroom, once suffocating with fear and uncertainty, now carried a profound sense of justice. The trial was over, the guilty exposed, and the child's 2 words, simple, yet devastating, had echoed louder than any legal argument, any objection, any attempt at manipulation. He knows, and in that moment the entire room understood. The truth cannot be hidden. Not from a child who sees, not from a dog who senses, and certainly not from justice itself. The courtroom exhaled as one. Justice had been served.